Horkrat wants to know if he should service his engine at the end of the season or at the beginning of the following season. That is a phenomenal question, Horkrat. Thank you for commenting and subscribing. We also want to thank our sponsor for the podcast that helps bring you these episodes to answer these questions in this format, and that is partsview.com. They are a parts and outboard superstore. You can get a discount if you use the link and coupon codes in the description below, but they also have all kinds of stuff outside of the maintenance kits and the parts and all the other stuff that they provide. They have like safety gear and water sports stuff and other miscellaneous things that you wouldn't really think about to have on your boat. They do have those as well. So check them out using the coupon codes and the links in the description below. Now, Horkrat, I do want to preface this by saying that a repair is not a service. Somebody said just the other day, if you don't schedule your engine's maintenance, it will schedule it for you, and this is 100% true. So when it comes to doing a service at the end of the season or at the beginning of the season, me personally, I am in the at the beginning of the season camp. Now, again, a service or maintenance is not a repair. Winterizing and summerizing your boat and your engine is not maintenance. So I'm saying that because there are a lot of people out there that consider repairs maintenance or service. Winterizing your boat and summerizing your boat isn't technically a service. A service is greasing everything on the engine, changing the oil, changing the gear lube, changing your thermostats, checking your timing belts, checking your spark plugs, going over the engine and making sure that all of those maintenance or serviceable items are in good condition or being replaced when they need to be replaced. For me, I like to do that at the beginning of the season, and I say that because everything is new. So generally after you do a service, especially if you do a 300-hour service where you get an impeller or you do something like that, you put the boat in the water and you run it. So running the engine and checking over the boat is, depending on who's doing your service, some marinas are completely different, some mechanics are completely different, and some services are completely different. So there are certain marinas and places that will charge you more. So let's say that you get a 100-hour service done on your engine, which is just an oil change, gear lube, and checking the belts, spark plugs, stuff like that. That doesn't really include looking over your boat, checking your boat's batteries, looking at your flares, looking at your safety equipment, checking all of your nav lights, your anchor lights, all that kind of stuff, the radio. That's not really included in a 100-hour service. A lot of marinas will put that into it. So like, let's say you're on a maintenance program or you're on a service program where when they do your 100-hour or your 300-hour, they will also check all of those components. There are those that do that. You pay more for that, but that is kind of in those services. So if you're on something like that, I think at the beginning of the season, that's when you want to do all of that stuff. You want to check everything at the beginning of the season, and it's a good time when you're doing a 100-hour or a 300-hour service on your engine to go ahead and check over the boat at the same time. So that's why I like to do it at the beginning of the season, because if you do it at the end of the season, again, this is not winterizing or summerizing your boat. If you do not winterize your boat, you're going to have problems. Like, especially if you're in a place that freezes, you can get a cracked block. You can have all kinds of other problems if you do not winterize your boat. So that is not a service. Generally, winterizing is just getting the water out of the engine, or like on IOs, a lot of people will just run antifreeze in the boat. So like you've got the raw water cooling system. So you will run the engine with antifreeze to get antifreeze all through all the cooling passages, and that will get rid of any water. And then you take the plugs out so it drains all out. Because if you don't get the water out and it freezes, you can crack your block and just have a major problem to deal with. And you also will fog the engine, which gets oil in the cylinders, your injectors, your intakes, all the internal components of the engine get lubed with a fogging oil. And then also you check the gear lube to make sure that there's no water in the lower unit, because again, if you're in a freezing area and let's say you have a prop shaft seal that's leaking and your lower unit has half of it full of water, well, the water is going to freeze. And when that freezes, it's going to destroy the lower unit basically. Now, if you live in South Florida or somewhere where it doesn't really freeze, that's not really as much of an issue. And just having water in the lower unit isn't really an issue either, because in and of itself, water really isn't the problem. It is whenever you introduce air into the system, that's when a wet component with water on it, with air, when the water evaporates, the minerals that are on the water are left behind on the metal, and then it just sits there and corrodes, rusts, oxidizes. That's when you have a problem. So if you have a little bit of water in your gear lube, and you let it sit for, say, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months over a off season when you're not using the boat, it isn't necessarily as bad as it would be in a freezing condition where if that water freezes, it's going to destroy your lower unit. So summarizing and winterizing isn't maintenance. That's not a service. If you blow up your lower unit and you replace your lower unit, that's a repair. That's not a service. So I just want to make sure that that is very clear, because a lot of people out there do confuse the two. A lot of people will think, oh, I've got an engine running problem, so I'm going to take my outboard into the shop and get that looked at and get that fixed, and then they consider that a service. That's not a service. You don't remodel your bathroom and call that maintenance. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a repair. That's not maintenance. So I just make sure those are very clear, that winterizing, summarizing, and repairs are not services. So doing a service at the end of the season, you would generally do your summarizing or your winterizing at the end of the season. And so that's not really a service. You can do your service, meaning your oil change, your gear lube change, all that kind of stuff, even though in a winterizing, if there's water in the lower unit, you change the gear lube and fill it up with new lube. So that part of the service wouldn't need to be done in the beginning of the season if you had to do that. Also, if you found a leak in the lower unit, you pressure test it, make sure that you fix the leak, and then put gear lube in there before, just calling it good. But outside of that, the reason that I would rather do it at the beginning opposed to the end is at the end of the season, you're putting your boat away to let it sit. So if you do your service at the end of the season, you change your oil filter, change the oil, change the gear lube, all that kind of stuff, and maybe you check over the boat a little bit, and now you're going to put the boat away and let it sit for 6, 7, 8 months, things will break. You could get rats in the boat. You could get, anything. Just take a pick. Bugs, mud daubers, termites, birds, cats, rats, raccoons, whatever, when a boat is sitting, it's just sitting there sitting. So that's generally when a problem is going to occur. Same thing with your batteries. The batteries are draining, all that kind of stuff. So for me, doing all that at the end of the season, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But then you let the boat sit, and now you're going to pull the boat out of storage and just start it up and treat it like everything just got done. Your service and all that stuff just got done, even though that was 8 months ago. So for that reason, I kind of tend to be in the camp of doing it at the beginning of the season. So that way you do your summarizing, you do your winterizing, put the boat away for storage. It's stored. When you pull it out of storage, then you do your service. So now you're going to be running the engine. You're going to be checking over stuff, your batteries. You can go ahead and look at your nav lights, your washdown pumps, your anchor lights, like all that stuff, and kind of inspect it all because you're doing your service. So it's a good time to do that kind of maintenance. And in that way, you're ready for the season. Like, you've already kind of went through everything and you've fixed any problems, or you're aware of any problems that you have on the boat that could have occurred while the boat was just sitting there, because that's when a lot of times stuff breaks. So for me, that's why I say that I'm the beginning of the season service guy, not the end of the year, end of the season service guy. I'm more of a summarize, winterize at the end of the season, put it away for storage, and then when you pull it out, go through the boat, do a service, check everything out, and then that way you're giving yourself a better chance of having less problems during the boating season when you do it that way, because you're going through all the boat before you start taking it to the lake, taking it offshore, going to the ramp, putting the boat in the water, running it out, and then, oh wait, you're coming back at night and you go to use the nav lights and the nav lights don't work. That's kind of how that kind of stuff works. Or you're halfway offshore and you realize the VHF radio doesn't turn on, or the radio's not working right, or whatever. If you're doing that service and checking over the boat at the beginning of the season before you go out, it's a higher chance of having a successful season with less problems, in my opinion. TBCD says, what is MEK? So we're talking about methyl ethyl ketone, I think is how you say that. And it's just think of it like a catalyst or a hardener for polyester resins. So whenever you're doing fiberglass, you've got basically two types of things. You got epoxy or you've got polyester, and MEK is basically the hardener, the catalyst, the kickoff for your polyester resin. That's all it is. It's just a chemical that creates a reaction within your polyester resin. Again, it's methyl ethyl ketone. I think it's how you say it. Something like that. But yeah, that's all it is. It's a catalyst. The Gun Nut says, you have GPS. Is a compass really needed? I am definitely going to say yes, that a compass is still needed. In this video, talking about moving a compass and stuff like that, and having stuff around the compass. So a compass runs off of a magnet. Well, there's different types of compasses, but generally they are run off of a magnetic, would be the right way to say that. If you put a magnet close to it, it's going to mess it up. Or if you put a lot of electronics close to the compass, it can interfere with the way the compass works. So that's the best way I can kind of describe it in, without using big words that make it confusing. So a compass is definitely still needed on the boat. The compass, in my opinion, though, nowadays, obviously, so if you're boating in a river or a lake or your shore is right there and, there's people going up and down the river, there's people going up and down the lake, you are around a lot of people, a compass is probably not needed as much, but I still think a compass should be on a boat in case of a failure. So let's say something happens, if your battery dies. If your battery dies and all of your, GPS and all that stuff, none of the electronics are going to work. In the event that the electronics fail, if you don't have cell phone range, something like that, like a compass is there as a backup, in my opinion, these days, that if you have a failure on the boat, you have a compass to you. That way you can at least figure out which way you need to go. Take being in South Florida, for example. If your electronics fail and you're offshore and you don't, maybe it's at night or it's in the middle of the day when the sun's above you and you can't really tell which way is north, south, east, west. When the sun is setting or the sun is rising, it's a lot easier to know your directions. But at the same time, if you don't know your seasons, then knowing which direction you're going to be going can be more complicated, because in the winter versus the summer, the sun is going to sunrise and sunset either more south or more north, depending on the season. And then it always rises in the east and sets in the west. So in the morning, the sun's coming up on your east, which way is north. So South Florida, or even, in the Panhandle or anywhere, Mississippi, Alabama, if you're offshore and you have a problem, you see the sun coming up, to get back to land, you need to go north. And so that's kind of the reason you need to know those directions. But in the middle of the day, something happens, the compass is there as a backup for you to know which way to go in order to get back to where there's either going to be people or shore or, safety, I guess is the way to put it. You need to know how to get back and which way you're going in direction when you're offshore or something like that. If you are on a little lake, a little river, yeah, it's not really as needed, but I still think that you should have a compass on the boat in order it's an emergency thing. It's a safety concern. So, and then there's a lot of people that still like to navigate using a compass. So, there is that, but yeah, for sure, compass on the boat. Like on that one, we put a phone charger right next to the compass. Will it interfere when you're using a phone charger? It's very likely. But again, that compass is only there for emergencies, and that's a river boat. So, that boat's only going out fishing on rivers. We ain't going offshore in the Gulf, going 30 miles offshore in that boat. So the compass really isn't needed on the boat, but it's definitely there for a backup for safety. I wouldn't get rid of the compass. I would like to have one on the boat for that reason. Wild Bill says, is the Mercury 50 horsepower system reliable? Talking about oil systems, and on a 2-stroke engine on a 50 horsepower, I would probably go ahead and pre-mix that engine, depending on which one it is. But most of the Mercury 50 horsepower 2-strokes, I would be leaning towards pre-mixing them and, getting rid of the oil system. Just personal preference. This day and age, it's a 2024, so we're talking about 20, 30-year-old 2-strokes, and the oil systems on those, some of the Mercuries had like a plastic rod that ran the oil pump that could fail. It could get chewed up. So I'd be looking into premixing that engine for sure. As far as reliable on that engine, when it came out, yeah, but 30 years into the future today, I'd probably be premixing that biscuit. Bill Nelson says, bought a 2001 Merc 150 CXL 2-stroke 8 years ago. Compression test back then said 85 PSI on all 6 cylinders. We checked it with 2 testers and got the same results. Based on your info, I should have passed on the engine 8 years later. It has the same numbers and same performance as it did when I bought it. Thoughts? So 85 PSI is still a little low. Granted, it's a 2-stroke, so not really a problem. Most 2-strokes are going to be in the 90 to 100, 105, 110, somewhere in that range is generally where you're going to see a compression test on a 2-stroke. Was it cold? Was it hot? That might play into it a little bit, but also compression test numbers are also dependent on battery voltage, the battery wires to the starter, and your starter. So your starter relay as well. So if you have a starter relay that is a little bit weak, you have a starter that's a little bit weak. If the engine is turning over slower, you're going to get lower compression numbers. Main thing with something like that is the difference between all of the cylinders. These are just my thoughts that you were asking for. If you've got all the cylinders are 85, I wouldn't even bat an eye at it. I'd say send it just like you have. You've been running the boat for 8 years, so obviously it's not a problem. Now, if you get something like 50, all right, that's a red flag. You've got something going on there. A compression number basically just gives you an idea of the mechanical integrity of the engine. So compression test, as long as there's nothing wrong with the cylinder walls, with the piston rings, with the piston itself, you're going to get compression. I mean, it's just mechanically what's going on. Now, how much compression are you getting? That's kind of also mainly determined on how fast the engine is turning over. If you got a weak battery or you've got a problem with your battery cables going to the engine where it's not getting all that amperage, you might never see a problem with it. But at the same time, your compression numbers might be a little bit lower because of how quickly the engine is turning over. It doesn't really do much outside of that as far as a compression test goes. A better test on like 4-stroke stuff like that are leak down tests and things like that. That lets you know a little bit more. A compression, the engine's going to make compression when you turn it over. As long as you ain't got a hole in the cylinder or one of your piston rings is just completely wiped out. Usually you either have, good compression and everything is pretty well close together, or you've got, one cylinder is 50 or 0 and everything else is at 100. Usually there's a big gap there when looking at compression test numbers, because unless there's a problem, most of them it's going to be pretty close. You're either going to be real close together, or if you're a little bit farther apart, you've got carbon buildup or something like that is not allowing it to get all the way up in that cylinder. But generally, your compression numbers should be pretty close. 85 is a little bit low, but obviously it's not a problem. Just thoughts off the top of my head. Jake Jacobson says, so I just bought a 24-foot boat inboard outdrive and I want to convert that to hydraulic steering so I can put an autopilot on it now. Is that just as easy to do, or could I go get an autopilot without making it hydraulic? So, yes, you can. So they do make autopilots for mechanical cables. I don't really know the exact horsepower ranges and stuff like that on how much it can go. Also, this is an inboard with an outdrive. So, they do make. There are companies, Lowrance, Raymarine. There's a couple other ones. There's different companies that make different types of steering, like autopilots. And yeah, some of them, they do make them for mechanical cables. You still have to change out, for a lot of them, you have to change out your helm and stuff like that. So that way it's got a reference. The autopilot has to be able to control your steering. So, and then I think there's one even that goes mounts on the steering wheel, and then it just turns the steering wheel back and forth based on, your heading sensor and GPS and stuff like that. But yes, you can do it without converting to hydraulic. But if you're going to spend $1,000-$1,500, converting to hydraulic would probably be just as easy, and it's going to be more of an upgrade for your steering system too. So, they do make them for mechanical. You don't have to go to hydraulic, but hydraulic isn't really a bad upgrade if you're wanting to put an autopilot on there. Autopilot's pretty much, control the engine based on a heading sensor, a GPS that controls which way the engine goes. And I would be considering going ahead and converting. Mike Neal says, I enjoy the channel and podcast. Any reason you didn't add a valve to the bait well through hulls? I know didn't have it factory, but such a good idea, and lets you swap pump cartridges out on the water if bait well fails, and of course close for safety. So Mike, that is a great observation, because I didn't even notice it. I didn't even looking down in the builds, changing out live well pumps and all this stuff, the boat's on the water, so I didn't even think about it, and I didn't even look or notice that there are no shutoff valves on that Key West. That's crazy. I mean, that's one of those things, I guess, that you become accustomed to and you overlook because you're not even thinking about it. You're like, why wouldn't there be a shutoff valve on the through hull that's below the water line on this boat? But yeah, I mean, now it's got me thinking, how many flats boats or smaller boats out there don't have shutoff valves on these things? I mean, that might be part of the reason why you see all the, bass boats and stuff like that. You see these videos of these boats that are going under they left the drain plug out, and they didn't leave the drain plug out. They just got a problem with their live well, and it's leaking water into the boat, and it's sinking the back of the boat because there's no shutoff valve. So, yeah, Mike, that was a great observation. I didn't even notice it. Now, do I go back and put live well shutoff valves on there or not? I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. It would definitely be a way better idea. I didn't even notice it, and I'm surprised. It's amazing. I'm trying to think of all the boats that I've been on, flats boats and bay boats, stuff like that. How many of them didn't have shutoff valves on those? I can't even come up with an answer to that, because it's something that I never put the time in to look at, and you just always think that that's there. It's one of those safety things that you think they're not putting through hull shutoff valves on the through hulls. There's no way you would do that, but obviously they do. So great observation, Mike. Thank you for pointing that out. Jake Moser says, just bought a boat. Guy told me the gauge didn't work, but could take it out 3 weekends before I had to fill up the tank. Again, took it out 3 hours, ran out of fuel, and trolled an hour back to the dock. Wow. Talking about fuel tanks and fuel gauges, 100%. We've all been there. Everybody, well, I guess I can't say everybody, but a lot of people have been out on the water and ran out of fuel. I've been there myself. Fuel gauges will do that. 3 weekends in a row before you have to fill it up. That's an interesting way of gauging how much you're burning in fuel or your fuel consumption. That's a good measurement, 3 weekends. But I guess if you're on the same lake, on the same river, you're doing the same thing, then yeah, you would dial that in. But obviously that's not going to be, if you sell the boat and buy a boat, that's not a gauge for someone else to use. You have no idea how someone else is going to use the boat and how far they're going to go. So to say you can got 3 weekends before you got to fill the tank up, that is a interesting thought 3 hours before you ran out of fuel, like that thing must have been bone dry. So, but I mean, I've been there before. I've been, looking at a fuel gauge, says I got 3/4 of a tank. I just filled it up the weekend prior, and the lake that we went out on, we didn't go that far, so there's no way we would have burned that much fuel. But I've been there before. Fuel gauge says 3/4, and you go 7 miles and run out of fuel. Been there, Jake. It happens. So definitely make sure your fuel gauge is working, or if it doesn't work, fill the tank up. Like if that's what's going on, especially if you're going offshore or something like that and using a lot, if you're on a big lake, fill that tank up. Don't try and play the whole, I can run half a tank and quarter tank, I can go this many miles. Well, when you start looking at current and wind and weight on the boat, that fuel consumption changes. It's not that consistent as you might think it is, whereas your car, the only factor in a car is wind. So like if you are in your car driving 5 miles all the time, your fuel consumption is going to be pretty much the same. Now, with the factor of wind against the car and your speed. In a boat with the current, and you put an extra 600 pounds in the boat this trip out, you took 3 more people out, it was blowing 20 miles an hour, and the current, we're going against the current, fuel consumption can range a lot in a boat for that reason. So don't try and risk it. Just fill it up. GRG says, great video and great detail. I am doing the same to my boat as the wiring was a spider web. So talking about rewiring a boat here. One thing I am rethinking after watching your video is the AUG of the navigation lights. I used a 20 gauge instead of 16 gauge like you used. Wondering if that was a mistake. Any thoughts? Thanks. So, as far as wire gauge goes, 20 gauge is a little light. That is definitely on the light side. 16 gauge is pretty normal for any wiring. But if your navigation lights are, if you're using LED navigation lights and you only had to go 10, 15 feet, 20 gauge is probably going to be all right. It's going to be kind of like if you had to go a longer distance, then, 20 gauge might not be enough. But when you think about what a navigation light is, especially if you got a bicolor, light that's only a single light, that's only one light bulb, generally, 20 probably going to be all right. You're probably not going to have any problems. But if you got 2 separate lights and you're splitting it, and it's an old incandescent bulb, it's not an LED bulb, you could just turn the light on, run it for an hour, feel the wire. If the wire's getting hot, then you might want to change that wire out. If not, 20 gauge, you probably get by with it. You probably won't have a problem now that it's already run. I know, going back and pulling this wire back out of the boat and changing out just because of that wire gauge. 4 gauge doesn't seem like that big of a deal. For a navigation light, it probably isn't a big deal. I'd be probably leaving it opposed to changing out the wire. But obviously the situation is going to vary on distance and the type of light you're trying to run. Beach Native says, great video. So the Blue Sea Systems mini ATA battery ACR SI is connected to the yellow wire. So talking about key switches and stuff like that, and then now talking about an ACR, which is an automatic charge relay. So the yellow wire on like Yamaha, that is your key on wire. So no, you would not hook that up to the ACR SI. So the SI is, what do they call it? That is the starter isolation. So your start isolation is usually used on inboards. I mean, the outboards, it's not really that big of a problem. A lot of people, it's not even hooked up on the vast majority of boats with outboards. The inboards, though, you can get a very large amp draw whenever you're running that starter. So because you have that high amp draw on the starter, it creates a high amperage load on the batteries and your battery cables and your battery switch. And if you have an ACR, that ACR, you're running that high amperage, that big draw, that power draw is running through that ACR. So what the start isolation does is you hook the wire, the start isolation, the SI wire, from your key switch, but you use the start wire, which means whatever wire activates the start relay to run the starter. And then whenever you start the engine, you let go of the key or whatever, and the engine starts to run, the starter's not running anymore. There's no more power on that wire. So that wire is what you hook up to the SI for your charge relay, your automatic charge relay, ACR, SI, start isolation. That's what that's for, is to, as soon as you turn the starter on, when that starter's running and it's drawing all that amperage to get that engine to start and turn over, it disconnects the ACR, so that way you're not running that power draw through the ACR, wearing out your ACR. So it's not really what you're thinking about as far as like an activation for the ACR. The ACR is an automatic charge relay. It does everything automatically based on charge voltage. So it is not necessarily something that you have a hook a wire up to for it to activate. It just basically needs to be grounded and between the two batteries, and based on the ACR, it senses this battery's charging up and this battery's not. If this one gets to a certain charge voltage, it will open up and allow the charge voltage to go over to the other battery. So that way you can charge both batteries off of one engine, and that's basically how a charge relay works. So just a little bit, the SI is start isolation. It's not about turning it on, turning it off. Rocky Nemia. Any suggestions for this exact scenario except the nut that holds the fuel cylinder completely corroded through? So now you need to A, replace your fuel tank, or B, put a new hex head in the plastic tank for the new fuel pickup to thread into. So talking about plastic fuel tanks and how the nut that the fuel pickup screws into, a lot of times that nut will spin. You get corrosion on the pickup and you can't get the pickup out. The nut will spin and you got to, basically destroy it to get it out. So when that happens, a lot of times you have to, replace the tank, or so you would think. I would do this. So on this situation, which this has happened quite a few times, and the success that I've had to fix it is that you find another nut to replace that one. So generally you've got your tank and the nut is on the bottom molded into the tank, and the fuel pickup threads through it like that. So you've got, this much space there. What I do is I use a product called Tap Polyweld. It is a plastic weld. You can also use a plastic welder. You could also use JB plastic weld or plastic bonder. But Tap Plastic is going to be the hardest. It's going to be the strongest. It's Tap Plastic Polyweld. And you find yourself a nut, that's, decently height-wise, maybe 3/8 of an inch, a larger nut that will give you strength when you screw your pickup into it, and make sure your pickup will thread through that. Now take your Tap Polyweld, and I would clean the surface of the fuel tank, scratch it up, and then use something like a contact cleaner or an acetone or a chemical that is going to soften up the plastic of the fuel tank. And that's going to give you adherence to it. So that's going to make the polyweld adhere to the plastic and actually get a bond that's going to make it stick. So now you just take that nut that you got and you've cleaned up the area where the pickup goes, weld that nut to the top of the tank, and then cover that nut with the polyweld. If you don't want to have to ever deal with it again, and when you do have to deal with it again, you plan on just scraping that off and pulling the whole thing out, then put the pickup in the nut and just weld the whole thing to the top of the tank. With that polyweld, just cover it, put it underneath the nut and then put it around the nut, put it on top of the nut, and put it around the pickup. So that way that whole thing is just, when that polyweld hardens, that thing is going to be stuck to that tank. It's not going to come out. Whenever you're putting your fuel line onto the pickup, though, be careful with that. You might even want to put that on there before, because that's generally when you're going to break that seal, if it is, because when the boat's just going around, there's not a lot of stress on the pickup. You shouldn't have the fuel line or your fuel hose so tight that it's putting stress on your pickup. So as long as you don't have stress there, it's just there. It's not really taking a beating. It's not taking stress. So that poly weld will hold. And yeah, that's how you're going to fix that without having to replace your whole fuel tank. Use the poly weld. Art Vandalay says, true or false? Boat hooks are just for greenhorns. I hear old guys say this all the time. So an essential piece of equipment is a waste of money or just for newbies. Sure looks like you don't need one. Great video, very succinct, talking about docking a boat. And he's talking about whether or not a boat hook is just for noobs or not. I mean, I don't know if I would say that a boat hook is just for noobs. I mean, I personally don't really carry one on my boat, but we usually have a gaff. So a gaff will work just as well, but generally it's the conditions that you're in. If you are going to, even if you know how to drive a boat and you're pretty good at driving a boat, sometimes a boat hook is very handy, because if you're going places that you don't normally go, like if you're going to the same dock in the same place in the same waters all the time, generally you're going to get so accustomed to the waters and the dock that you know when to turn, how to turn, where to put the boat, and how to dock it. So you don't really, not really a problem for you. But if you are going to new areas, new docks, new marinas, high traffic areas, restaurants, stuff like that, having a boat hook or a gaff isn't necessarily a bad idea or just for noobs, because you don't know the conditions when you get there. I mean, there's docks in some places that have such high current coming through there that it can be difficult to get the boat on there. So having that to where you can hook, pull the boat in, or if there's boats around you that need help, and you know this guy's coming close to you, he's going to hit your boat, this, that, and the other, you can use a boat hook to push them away. So I don't know about a waste of money and just for newbies. I think depending on how you're using your boat, you know, eventually you'll get well enough driving the boat that you really won't need it as much, but there are situations that you could need it. So having, you know, a gaff is same thing, or something that, you know, you can throw a line on a cleat to kind of grab it. You can throw a line around a piling to kind of hold the boat, because if you're going to an area that you're not used to and you don't know what's there and a big gust of wind comes, it can be difficult to be able to, you know, maneuver the boat the way you normally have control over it. So I don't know if I would say it's just for noobs. And I would also say if you need it, don't be ashamed to use it. I mean, like, who cares? I think it's a better thing to use your boat, because the more you use your boat, the less you're going to need it. So if having a boat hook and you using it for a year, I don't think that's a problem, because if you're using your boat for a year, chances are by the end of the year, you're going to not really need the hook as much as you did in the beginning. So yeah, if that's what you need to learn to get to here, then use it. Don't be ashamed about it. Don't worry about what other people say. Enjoy your boat, enjoy the water, keep going. And yeah, that's my 2 cents there. LS says Yamaha 92 stroke. They're like batteries. Yummies don't die, they're murdered. I like that. I'm gonna be using that one, LS. I do like that. I'm gonna be using that one. It's just like we were talking about earlier about the guy saying that schedule your engine's maintenance or it will schedule it for you. That is very true. Yamahas don't die, they are murdered by maintenance. I love that. That's beautiful. Merl Patterson says sometimes if you have a narrow gap between a panel and a backer, you can shove a deflated wheelbarrow inner tube in between and then inflate it to help pop it free. That is outstanding information. Great trick. Thank you, Merl. Yeah. On that video, I think we were doing with a transom, working with fiberglass, we're trying to get something to pop, but definitely I do like that. That's outstanding information, giving you the idea to think outside of the box. I like it, Merl. Thank you. That's good. I mean, that's the whole reason for the podcast, is to be able to share information like that. And it's a podcast, so you're going to get information and pull nuggets out of it that are going to be, that you don't know when you're going to use, but now you're thinking outside of the box. So hopefully it's making you a better boater. That's what our goal is here. And we'll do one more from Great. So Great says, I started life in poverty. I am now in extreme abundance. Maintaining my own vehicles has been an essential key to get there. I have not made a car payment in decades and have been using that for investments. I am now almost a millionaire, not counting my home because then I am, and have a large homestead that is running tip top. So is my boat. Great. Little bit of a humble brag there, but I love it. It's a very positive note, and I appreciate you sharing this. I think this is something that a lot of people will definitely find some encouragement for. So yeah, everybody should be taking encouragement from this. A lot of us do start in poverty, and it takes hard work and motivation to get there. So hopefully this helps motivate you to do your own maintenance, take care of your boat, service your own stuff, save that money. Don't make payments on stuff. Go out and get yourself into a $400,000 boat loan that you're making payments on over the next 40 years. Anything with wheels or an engine, don't finance it. Pay cash for it. Great. I think that's a great... I think you're doing great, and I appreciate you sharing that with us, and hopefully that helps to motivate others to, take care of your stuff, do your own work, get a little bit more dirty, hands-on, and just keep going. Positive note for you on this podcast.